Hello, welcome to the Innovation and Diffusion podcast. I'm Raveda Gosen, and it's been a while since we actually recorded an episode, but I'm really happy for the third season, and we're starting with Fiona Murray. How are you, Fiona? Welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Raveda, thank you for having me. I very much appreciate being here with you. If that is my laptop, I've been trying to turn off notifications, so I'm going to do that a little better. So one thing that you'll learn about me is, although I love studying innovation, I'm not actually brilliant at the latest in new technology. So hopefully this is a warning to our listeners.
It takes time to adapt, right? So Fiona, to introduce you to our audience, Fiona is the Associate Dean of Innovation at MIT and the William Porter Professor of Entrepreneurship. And you're also the chair of the NATO Innovation Fund. And you served on the British Prime Minister's Council on Science and Technology and you were awarded Commander of the British Empire for your services to innovation and entrepreneurship in the United Kingdom. I mean, if you were a soldier, you would have a lot of stars on your shoulder, like all these stars and everything. And this is a shorter introduction.
Thank you. Yes, look, I've had the opportunity to do some amazing things throughout my career. And it's always been really important to me that as we generate academic insights and sort of theoretical and empirically grounded insights, that we make sure that we translate those into actionable things that decision makers can use. And I'm often and increasingly very happy to sit beside those decision makers actually taking those actions. And whether that's doing that in the risk capital domain. So I'm now chair of the NATO Innovation Fund, which is NATO's first sort of effort to build a venture capital fund to crowd private capital into startup innovation in defense, security, and resilience. I've also worked on building new types of fund mechanisms to get new innovations into climate technology, and then a bit earlier in my career in the life sciences. And so I've always been really interested in how we translate these amazing kinds of research papers into actual policy and investment instruments that will really make a difference to the world around us.
Yeah, you also have, I was actually going to talk about this a bit later, but you're also doing different types of programs at MIT with private executives. Some of those programs are, for example, like one of them is Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program at MIT, and you designed and delivered new MIT programs to train over like 2,500 private sector executives. And there are other programs as well, but it looks like, I actually wanted to ask you this because in academia, in general, people might feel unheard. And you might feel what you do is not valuable because you just, we write papers, especially in maybe social sciences. I don't know if I were an engineer, maybe I wouldn't feel that way. But like you write papers and then you think, well, what is my impact? What am I changing? So did you feel ever like that? And then that maybe drove you to, to these different types of, program like leadership? What do you think?
Yes. So look, I started my career. I'm trained as a chemist. So my undergraduate and master's degrees are in chemistry, and then I did my PhD in engineering. And what I loved about that is I felt like I was really doing something right at the knowledge frontier that wasn't the most brilliant laboratory-based researcher, and I got increasingly interested, particularly during my PhD, first in economics. And so I'm sort of a slightly self-trained economist, and a lot of my economics knowledge has come from really being at MIT and having the great pleasure of working with some extraordinary economists. Scott Stern was my first economics, sort of an economist co-author. I subsequently got to work with Philippe Aghion, so I was especially pleased that he got the Nobel Prize, along with Joel Mokyr, whose work I particularly admire. I've always loved economic history. I think it's so important because it really tells us, in such depth about the past and the trends, particularly in technology and innovation. And so I shifted into this more sort of understanding the systems, right? The policy systems, the economic systems that were going to drive innovative activities. The useful thing about being in a business school is that your students are actually going to go out into startup companies, into large corporations, and they really want, as we like to say, news you can use in the classroom. And so from a very early time in my teaching, I had quite demanding students who might have been interested in the abstract of my academic research paper or a very juicy graph or some interesting finding, but they really wanted things that were of practical relevance. Right from the beginning of my academic career, I was sort of moving backwards and forwards between the kind of empirical evidence base, doing as careful studies as we could with all the causal identification, but also trying to translate that on a daily basis in the classroom. And over time, I've started to teach increasingly more senior executives. And so when MIT we created our executive MBA program, I had this wonderful opportunity to be part of that design and created something called Idea Week. An IDEA is a sort of acronym that's meant to stand for Innovation-Driven Entrepreneurial Advantage, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it works as a shortening. And the general premise is let's have executives really understand what it's like to be an entrepreneur trying to take something very novel and just begin that journey. We're not saying that everybody should become an entrepreneur, but rather if you understand that iterative experimentation-based process, that you will be much better able to connect to entrepreneurs, to understand how they operate, and to really then tap into some of their ideas, to partner with them and to work with innovation ecosystem. And so that's a course that in a week sort of boils down theory and practice. People get to listen to lectures, hear visitors, do hackathons. And so that has been very much a part of my sort of teaching. And then some of the other programs are very, very specifically focused on incredibly practical questions.
Yeah, that sounds great. So then there has been some evolution, like over time, how you got interested in economics, and then through your teaching and interest and there is demand as well, like for practical suggestions. So that sounds really great. I was going to ask you, for example, your mentors or role models. Were there anyone at the time that drew you to economics of innovation?
So really, as I say, when I was in graduate school, so I did my undergraduate degree in the UK. I went to Oxford, and then I came over to Harvard to do my PhD, and I was in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. I had an advisor, though, who actually always suggested to his students that although we were really focused on understanding both chemical transport models at the time, we were working on sort of the transport of different pollutants in the atmosphere, both sulfur dioxide, acid rain, which is not a thing people really talk about anymore, but also carbon dioxide and particulates and whatnot. And we were connecting those to some very sort of specific engineering models. He had always worked in interesting policy environments, and he sent most of his students off to do some microeconomics in particular. And so that's really where it started for me, was taking some micro courses. And I'll tell you that, frankly, having taken a lot of chemistry and engineering, doing micro was quite light relief from my point of view. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I thought it was really fun. And I then decided I wanted to learn a bit more. So I ventured a little further afield. And for those people who know Harvard, if you were in the engineering and applied sciences, we were sort of up the road. You kind of first go down the road to the economics department. And then I went a little further down towards the river to the School of Government and took some policy classes. And then I actually was quite bold and ventured over the river to Harvard Business School and took a number of classes and ultimately became a research assistant for Professor Richard Vitor. And Dick was a professor in the group that they call BIGI, Business, Government and the International Economy. And it was really working with him. He was probably the first person that I worked closely with who was really interested in firms and the kind of economic and policy environment that these companies found themselves in. And that started me thinking about the importance of such things. And eventually Dale Jorgensen from the econ department actually was on my thesis committee, because I was looking at how these different chemical models, engineering models, got nested in policy decisions. And the particular data sets that I gathered and used were actually about China, which again, today seems quite fashionable. But at the time, people thought that was quite strange, just sort of looking at their entire power grid system and the use of different sorts of technologies for power plants and what have you. And so that really started me getting interested in this. And then I went to Oxford and joined the faculty of the management school and was supported by a number of people. But it was really coming to MIT, frankly, and meeting first Scott Stern, who became a close co-author very early on. He introduced me to the NBER community, the sort of economics of innovation and entrepreneurship. And, I had the great privilege, I think, of being part of that community at a time when it was and continues to be incredibly vibrant. And I met people like Philippe and Joel Mokia quite early on, as well as Paul David. I was a huge admirer of Paul David's work as well, and really had a chance to be inspired, I think, by them. Particularly as an outsider to economics, economic history, I think, is it's a little easier to enter into that literature because it's less technical. And because so much of the early economic history of innovation is sort of grounded in things that were happening in the UK, that piqued my interest. And I had also, as a chemist, been really interested in the emergence of the chemical dye industry, because that had a lot to say about academics, about IP and intellectual property, about the movement of IP and IP theft from one side of Europe to another. So there were many threads that
Yeah.
came together for me.
And it looks like, I mean, since you started as a chemist, do you think that that give you some advantage? You know how labs work, how scientists work, and in the innovation field, science and how science contributes to, you know, to new ideas and how they feed into each other, etc. This is a really important kind of aspect. So do you think that that give you some advantage, maybe like that you could benefit from?
I think it certainly gives me a different point of view, right? And so what I was trying to do was do research that I thought that would be better done by somebody with a really deep appreciation of both the daily life of science and scientists, and also where if you have a really sort of deep understanding of the way in which scientific knowledge is being produced, you could perhaps structure your studies a little differently. And so I don't think it gave, it was the advantage that I had that I tried to use in studies to make them of interest to other people. And I think every different scholar brings their own particular advantages and interests. But for example, some of my early work, which is focused on this notion of patent paper pairs, this idea that when knowledge is produced, it was often instantiated by those developing the idea. They would write a paper, but they'd also write a patent. And it wasn't that one came after the other. It wasn't that I did the paper and then I did more work and I wrote the patent, but that in fact, at least in a place like MIT, the set of experiments that somebody might do, whether it was in, developing new kinds of tissue engineering or transgenic mice or new sorts of chemistry and new materials, there were these two different outputs, and those had really important implications for whether the ideas were controlled by intellectual property because some of the timing issues. And we could really use that as a window into the ways in which, as an idea moves forward, it both furthers academic inquiry back into more fundamental questions, and simultaneously it can further translational inquiry. It can further the development of startups, and then this whole cascade of risk capital coming in. And so again, I've tried to use some of the scientific sort of insights that I had about that to really understand those processes as best I possibly could.
Yeah, this is really nice. And you also define regional ecosystems or innovation ecosystems, which is something we're going to talk about. But before we go into those, I want to ask you, I was talking to a friend from the University of Michigan, and we were talking about entrepreneurship. And one of the things that she said was entrepreneurship is basically failure. You fail so many times, and then after 100 times, get something successful, you do something right, and then it just happens. So it's really about being resilient to failures. So I'm going to ask you the same thing. Were there any failures that you faced during this whole process, like from being a PhD student until you find a job, or after you found a job? So can you give us an example from your life, like, this was a failure that I had at the time, and then I learned this and that, and I suggest this?
So first, I'd say for every single paper that people see published, that is, by the time it gets published, often looks quite beautiful and is written in really nice sentences. The number of iterations and drafts and edits, and the number of revisions and the revise and resubmit is really significant. And I'm always reminded of this idea that the search in research is to search for new things, and the in research is to do it again and again. And I think it's my friend Scott who reminded me of that fact. Every single paper that we see published is iteration. I think the beginning of any big research project is actually itself quite a scary thing. I mean, I remember when I started the research on the oncomouse, right, which was a very specific scientific discovery that then led to the creation of this whole set of transgenic mice that have been really important in improving the efficiency of science, because it's think of it as a shared test bed, right, a standardization of experimentation. When I began that project, I had a very strong sense that I didn't have that many years before I was coming up for tenure. You only have so many hours in the day, even if we all work extraordinarily hard. And so it was, every big research undertaking is a big gamble. And you're hoping that you've made a good and wise choice to pick a research domain that will be fertile and rich, and you'll find something even though you're not sure. And so for me, I think just being brave was actually quite an important part of this, trying to speak with my own voice, understand what I thought was interesting, and have the courage of my own convictions. And there's a really interesting tension, whether it's as a scholar as an entrepreneur, starting a company, between this tension, I think, between having an idea that you think is really important and being willing to go after that idea with real focus and determination, and being willing to accept feedback and update your prior beliefs. And so being quite Bayesian. And doing both at the same time, I actually think is really hard. And there is this emerging area of Bayesian entrepreneurship, which colleagues like Joshua Gans and Scott Stern and others have been developing. I had the privilege of being part of some of those conversations and that first conference. And I also interviewed Nubar Rafayan, who's the founder of something called Flagship Pioneering. And Nubar is involved in what he calls venture creation. So rather than waiting for somebody else's startup to come to him, he starts by asking these what-if questions. Imagine science could do this. What kind of a business could we build? And then iterating and experimenting with those ideas and updating their beliefs. He does that on a massive scale. He does that for 5, 10, 50 companies a year that he doesn't even name. He just gives them a number until a few of them burst forth. And I think of research a little bit like that, but it requires this bravery, but also willing to get input. And I think that's a very interesting tension that we all have to try and work our way through.
You're right. In economics, for example, it takes a long time to publish a paper. Like, for example, if you look at computer engineering or other types of engineering, I mean, I hear from some of my friends, like every 6 months they have a published paper. It's just like, how is that possible? And they only write, for example, 10 to 11 pages, which is completely different than economics papers as well. So it does take some, you have to be determined. As you said, I mean, you'll get a lot of feedback. So you have to be open to that. And bravery, as you said, it's an important part of it.
You get a lot of feedback, and sometimes when I'm working with entrepreneurs, they'll say, "Oh, but so and so said something different," and my comment is, yes, welcome to the world. You'll get lots of feedback, and your job is to try to have the right filters, right? Is to try and listen to what people are really saying, try to understand why they have the beliefs they have. So if somebody tells you, this is a terrible market, why is that? Is that because they've tried it and it didn't work? Is that because of some specific piece of evidence they have? Trying to understand why people have these opinions will help you, I think, calibrate the information. And then at the end of the day, I think it's up to any one of us to try and work out what we can and can't do. On your point about speed, one of the things I've tried to do throughout my publishing, at least, is to publish in traditional economics or sociology journals when I can, but also to publish in the more scientific, the traditional science literature. So I publish in Science and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It does tend to be that it's shorter form, so people don't do as much literature review, and it tends to come out much more quickly. So the clock speed is much faster. And I do find that a real pleasure, because there's nothing like actually seeing something all beautifully laid out in print. And I think that clock speed is something that we ought to really appreciate. The other thing that scientists really like is they like literature reviews, because they actually do like to sort of say, hang on a minute, can we have a sort of state of knowledge? We don't really value that, although I'm seeing a bit more of that in places like Journal of Economic Perspectives, where people have done some brilliant sort of more review-oriented pieces around, for example, innovation policy tools and things like that, which I really, really enjoy.
Definitely. It also shows some knowledge accumulation, right? So what was happening? What's happening in the literature? What do people find? So let's switch to, we talked about Philippe Aghion and Joel Mokyr. Peter Howitt, Philippe Aghion, and Joel Mokyr, they won a Nobel Prize based on their contributions to this field. But let's talk about, what this Nobel Prize means for you, for economics, itself. Can you tell us a bit about your thoughts on this, Nobel Prize, and then about their work?
So first, I was extremely happy and so pleased, right, for people that I feel like I know, and I think all of us who know them couldn't be more delighted. And to be frank, I had the same feeling the previous year. I feel very fortunate when Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson and their colleague won the Nobel Prize as well. So it's like 2 years in a row. These are not just names that I'm familiar with, but people I actually know, who've I've sort of sat with around conference tables, who've written me tenure letters, or who have commented on my work and I've had the privilege to comment on theirs, or I've co-authored with them. And so that's a very special feeling, right? And what I have found so interesting and important is Daron and Simon's work has been very much about institutions and the role of institutions in economic growth broadly. And then this year with Philippe and Peter and Joel, it's been very much around the role of sort of institutions in innovation and the nature of those institutions supporting cumulative knowledge. So knowledge accumulation as a fundamental part of economic growth, and trying to recognize what are the institutional arrangements that make a difference to that, both conceptually. So particularly, I think Philippe's work with Peter on sort of creative destruction, but his more recent work that I've been quite involved in around sort of the open institutions of science versus the more sort of closed incentive-driven institutions as you get further down these research lines. And then Joel's work, which I would sort of articulate, is very much saying, look, many economies sort of develop new things, but it was really only those that had the institutions that enabled that knowledge to accumulate and valued the accumulation, valued us asking questions about why, and building on the shoulders, right, of one another, that really made a difference to those economies kind of taking off. And so that institutional lens is one that I've thought is very important, because it reminds us that we can do something, right? Institutions are things that we can change. Policymakers, politicians, leaders in many kinds of organizations. And we can change them at the organization level. We can change them typically at the regional and national level. But it allows us to think about instruments of change. And it does, I think it's also kind of empowering, I think, as an idea, that it's not just about the lone genius who sits under a tree or in a bath.
So, but when you think about innovations, there is always a discussion in this literature about like who becomes an inventor. It looks like there is maybe, especially in the past, like there was a certain group of people who were more wealthy and middle-aged white men. They were more active in this field. But even now, for example, when you think about women in the 19th century in the United States, they only, for example, represent 1% of all patents at the time, and now it's around like 10% or so. Still, it's quite low. What do you think about this? Because in one of your papers, you say that despite similar levels of STEM education or participation in STEM field, only about 10% of new inventors are women. And this is actually quite striking, because when you look at STEM participation, there are women. But why do you think there is this participation gap in innovations? What is happening exactly? Like, why don't we have the same representation as men in innovations?
Ooh, so look, I mean, this is the kind of thing that we could talk about for a very, very long time. And I think that there is no single answer to that question. And in a way, that's a shame, because I think if there was, then we would have a single solution probably, and we would be able to do something much more
Right.
quickly and more effectively about it. And what I've tried to do in my work is to sort of really try to sort of shine a microscope in some really careful ways into some of the dynamics that we think are at play. So, for example, in some of my earlier work with Toby Stewart and Waverley Ding, we were looking at the rate in which female faculty patented their ideas relative to male faculty members and similar, and we accounted for cohorts and training and so on. And one of the things that became really clear was at the time was that faculty were more likely to patent when they were in institutions where the rules of the game were much, much more clear. And so when the universities were very explicit about welcoming patenting, they were explicit about the process of invention disclosures. They had a very sort of open attitude towards patenting. It was considered to be a positive and a good thing. Because otherwise what happens is, in any society where something is sort of accepted but not completely, and perhaps the rules are vague and unclear, you have to be part of the in-group. And it doesn't really matter whether that in-group is sort of straight white men or, some other group. It's whoever's in charge of your institution. And if you're not in that group, you often don't know the informal rules. And so formality in that way was really helpful to female faculty. So making things more structured, more clear, less requiring of sort of understanding, being in the kind of club and the informal network. That said, we then started to look at the labs and the research labs of PhD advisors. And we certainly find that patenting is quite concentrated in academia amongst a handful of very, very professors who are extremely productive in terms of patenting. And there are, almost 100 or so of those individuals at MIT. It's quite an unusual place. But every university has some, right? This is not evenly distributed across faculty. And we started to look at what happens to the graduate students. And we found that those faculty often patent with their graduate students. And this is often how people in STEM fields, especially with PhDs, start to get ahead, right, and learn. What we found is that in any given lab of one of these, what we call top inventors, the male graduate students are almost twice as likely to co-patent with their advisor as the female graduate student. So remember, we're holding the lab constant and the advisor constant. We've even tried to account for the topical areas in people's PhDs. And this is research I've done with my friend and co-author Mercedes Delgado. And We don't have a particularly precise, we can precisely identify the phenomenon. Really getting to the bottom of what the mechanism is much, much more difficult. We suspect that there are a few things going on. If an advisor is sort of working on a project and thinking about patenting something, it may be that the person that they see who happens to be there saying, oh, I'd love to patent, this is really important. So some of this is about speaking up. And we know that female PhD students tend on average not to do that as much. And sometimes it's just those contributions perhaps being a little more overlooked. And so we think if that's true, that some of these things are increasingly more straightforward to fix. We know that interventions, again, like talking to graduate students about the fact that patenting is a brilliant idea, helping them learn how to patent, helping them understand there is a technology licensing office. These are all things that kind of level up the playing field, because we're talking about people, remember, who've already got into leading universities. Our study is American, but you could think of this in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, and people who've been accepted into brilliant laboratories. And so this is not a question of quality. This is all about being, if you're going to do something in addition to writing your papers, you're also learning how to be an inventor. And so getting into that flow just turns out to be really important.
Exactly. I think really the question is, how do you become an inventor, right? So it's an important knowledge there that you need to know. How do you do this, and then how do you participate? And then it's an important gap, actually.
Absolutely.
Gender is an important aspect, and especially like it's not only gender, but when you look at maybe different types of socioeconomic groups or racial groups, etc. I mean, there are also kind of existing other types of problems, but
Absolutely.
there is also the thing that it looks like some areas are more innovative, and then maybe that's like weather, like in some areas innovation can grow much faster and much better. So can we talk about those ecosystems as well? So what are those ecosystems that actually innovations thrive in?
So first, maybe just to take a step back, I think that ingenuity and human creativity is evenly distributed across the world and across people. Wherever you have humans trying to solve problems, we have incredible ingenuity. And the question is, how does that get channeled, right? Does it get channeled into entrepreneurship or not? Does it get channeled into innovation of the type that we think of when we think of innovation, by which we really often mean technical innovation? And then how are those ideas then, how do they grow, and do they take root in innovation driven enterprises, so high growth ambitious startups that are trying to actually develop new products that they're going to scale and sell, not just locally but regionally and around the world? And so the way in which that human ingenuity and creativity is channeled, I think, is really the question. And that is very much channeled, I think, by the institutions and rules of the economies around us. I was very struck reading Bill Baumol's work many years ago, who talks about the fact that the entrepreneurial effort in organized crime is really quite significant. But if you put those same humans in a different environment, many of them you would find being incredibly successful entrepreneurs. It's just that they would be in a set of very, very different incentives and a different incentive and opportunity space. And I always thought that was a really interesting kind of example. And we see the same in regions, right? If you put a very talented group of PhD students down in MIT in Kendall Square, you will see a flourishing of startups and huge growth ambition and what have you. 20 years ago, when I was at Oxford on the faculty, you would have had equally people with interesting ideas, but they would probably have not have thought that entrepreneurship and high growth entrepreneurship was for them. They wouldn't have thought of their ideas as ones that they should be really ambitious. If they wanted to solve a problem of, food allergies or something like that, they might have started a bakery, right? Instead of saying, let's start a sensor-based business. We had that issue with some of our students. So it's not that they come with big ambitions. They're often pressed into being ambitious by the other people around them and the incentives and the support mechanisms. And so the thing that we do in our program, which is called the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, REAP, is to have regions really first step back and say, where are our strengths in entrepreneurship? Where are our weaknesses? Where are our strengths in innovation, sort of the generation of ideas? Where are the weaknesses? How can we connect the strengths together? How can we strengthen entrepreneurship, the creation and growth of startups? How can we strengthen the generation and scaling of ideas? And how can we kind of couple those two engines together so that we get these innovation-driven enterprises? And then the third piece of that puzzle is for them to really think about the fact that most ecosystems, most places in the world that are really good at this, don't do this across all sectors of the economy. They tend to be specialized. Comparative advantage is a real thing. And so Greater Boston is all about the life sciences and also sort of robotics, defense, security, and so on. Silicon Valley has always been in chips and compute and software as a service, and now AI. Munich is very much around sort of robotics, precision manufacturing, and increasingly defense. And so it goes on. And so we also help regions really think about the seeds of their comparative advantage, what from the past gives them advantage for the future, and what's the direction that they might want to take their ecosystems in. And we then take a very multi-stakeholder view, that it's not enough to have, say, the university at the table or the government. You've got to have the entrepreneurs at the table, and you absolutely have to have the risk capital providers with them. And so you really need these 5 stakeholders working together.
So is this program, is it only at MIT, or like, do you also apply this program like to other parts of the world, or like other countries actually are receiving this program? And how does this work?
Yeah, so this is a program that we lead at MIT, but people come to us. So we invite people to apply, and regions will apply from all over the world. We worked with about 90 regions globally, and they will come and go through a sort of 2-year. We do a workshop every 6 months with a cohort of regions, typically 5, 6, 7 regions work with us. We basically share our frameworks, help them sort of design the right kind of analysis, data gathering activities, and then we work really closely with them as they design their own interventions to really improve their innovation ecosystems and to increase the rate of creation and growth of these innovation-driven enterprises. And so although we draw inspiration from what's happened in Boston, and we're learning from every region we work with, it's very much a global program that we invite people to come to campus. And we also write a lot about this. So Scott and I have written at great length on this subject, but it's really important to us that regions come, and we don't tell them what to do, but we help share frameworks that help them.
Really interesting. And I think it's a great opportunity for people. So if they don't know about it, they can just, check your website and then check MIT's website and try to find out that program. But there's also another question that I want to ask you. And this is about, like, we talked about at micro level kind of ecosystems, but there are countries, there is politics, and there are country blocks such as NATO. And as you mentioned, there are funds, for example, for innovation and stuff. But how do you see the tension, or like the relationship between security-driven innovation and market-driven innovation? Because at the moment, we kind of talked about market-driven innovation, but there is also the side where governments are involved. They give funds, and especially like for national security, because, we have nation states. There is that kind of innovation coming from the defense side as well. Are there spillovers, and how should the balance be? What is your view on these things? Shortly, yeah.
Of course. So, Rhoda, I think you've raised a very interesting question, and I would just rephrase it just a little bit. And I would say that countries have a set of challenges that they want to solve for their citizens. And those might be health challenges, right? They want to improve the health and well-being of their citizens. It might be climate. They've decided that climate is really important and we want more solutions. And similarly, we want to have more security, and we want to have defense and a deterrent against our adversaries. And I think traditionally, in any one of those 3 areas, we might have said, look, the government is going to invest in potential solutions. They're going to spend money, often in public institutions, and they're then going to develop those solutions and then kind of give them to their communities. We know that's not efficient, and so private markets are really about trying to provide incentives. And so the government then becomes a customer for those solutions. So the National Health Service in Britain is a customer for some of the newest medicines that get developed. So the government says, look, there's a market for carbon dioxide emissions reductions. Then we suddenly start to get to see private markets and entrepreneurship getting into that arena. And I think the same is true for national security and defense, is that the government increasingly realizes that they have no monopoly on wisdom. They might know the types of problems that they want solving. And so if they say that there really is a market, we're willing to buy new solutions, whether it's new kinds of drones, right, or new kinds of cybersecurity solutions, then you're beginning to see private ingenuity focused on those kinds of problems. What's different, I think, here is that because there's a word national in national security, which is exactly the point that you've made, is that you then say, well, are we going to make those solutions available to wide global markets, or are we somehow going to restrict them? And conversely, are we going to only buy from, solutions generated in our own country, or are we going to buy from, let's say, will the Europeans buy from the Americans? Will the Americans buy from the Europeans? And it's that latter piece that I think we haven't quite sorted out at the moment, because markets have to be big enough for the private incentives to really work. And I think we're seeing in Europe, in the US, that works reasonably well in defense and security. The market is quite large. Across Europe, it's growing and bigger, but very fragmented. And as Europe but also as NATO starts to figure this out, I think we're beginning to see really hard conversations about whether or not we can ensure that all that private sector ingenuity goes into some incredibly important solutions that will keep us resilient, that will keep us safe and protected. And in the worst situation, we can use to defend ourselves. Can we have markets that allow ingenious private sector actors, whether it's, the highly trained engineers or entrepreneurs? And how do we make sure that we safeguard these against our adversaries, but we create markets so that we get the best of ideas? And I think we're really wrestling with that intersection of national security and innovation at the moment. And more broadly, I think across all of our markets, geopolitics and the control increasingly of innovation, of capital flows, people flows, and sort of idea flows is really, I think, top of mind, and increasingly top of mind actually for economists, which is quite interesting. So it's
So it's a
intriguing
field
to see
that
these topics.
Yeah, so it's a field that maybe some can work on, and especially like from the philosophical perspective as well. Like I think we also need to think about like what is innovation and what does that mean, and it's really an important dynamic there. So I'll ask you then one personal question, and then we'll sum this episode up. So the question is, if you could travel back in time and have dinner with any scholar, philosopher, economist, or whatever, like real life or fictional character, whatever, who would it be, and what would you ask them? What would you talk about with them?
So I think I need to give you two answers, if I may. So I want to travel forward in time. I'm looking forward to talking to Joel Mokyr after he's been to Stockholm to receive his Nobel Prize and to see what that was like. Because he's always the most interesting human. And so I believe he might come and visit us at MIT. And so I'm going to travel forward in time and absolutely look forward to that. I'd like to travel back in time, not that far. And I would really, really find a conversation with Oppenheimer extraordinarily interesting. I mean, the Manhattan Project, I think, is an incredibly important moment in our scientific, technological, and frankly, sort of military history. It also led to, I think, the unfolding of some extraordinary events, some terrible, some, I think, all of them important. And trying to understand how somebody who is obviously a great scientific genius also then was able to deploy and be part of an enormous engineering project that was a great organizational feat, and then had to wrestle with, I think, the incredibly complicated politics and policies of the technologies of defense and security, and frankly the technologies of war, would just be a very, very important discussion, I think, to have, given what's on many of our minds today.
Thank you very much, Fiona, both for the talk and for your time. And thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode. Bye.